Okay, we are getting some breaking news from Reuters. Phil Stewart covers and has been covering this conflict for them. He says, scoop, U.S. military carries out new strikes in Iran, this time against a military site that posed a threat to U.S. forces and commercial traffic in the Strait of Hormuz, a U.S. official tells Reuters. The U.S. military has also intercepted drones being launched from Iran today. Okay, so that development just coming through. Let's bring in Edmund Fittenbrown. He's a senior fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. This was just posted 15 minutes ago, Edmund, and I'll read it again. I would love to get your reaction. Reuters says that the U.S. military carries out new strikes in Iran, this time against a military site that posed a threat to U.S. forces and commercial traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. Edmund, this is just being reported about 15 minutes ago. What is the significance? And there's still more to be learned about these strikes, but given what we know preliminarily, what are we to make of the U.S. yet again carrying out strikes, this time against a military site that they say posed a threat to the U.S. and to traffic in the Strait of Hormuz, Edmund?
Thanks, Austin. It's not a huge development. It's significant. I think what it reflects is the fact that we are on a knife's edge. People have sometimes mischaracterized this as a proper ceasefire. But if you think of the reality in the Gulf, you have a violent blockade of the Strait of Hormuz being carried out by Iran. And in response to that, you have a violent blockade of Iranian ports being carried out by the United States. So this is not really a ceasefire. This is an armed standoff. And it's no surprise at all if this kind of escalation happens.
So just kind of tell the audience where we should and how people who are watching this should view military actions like this. The Trump administration, I was on the desk on Saturday when we saw a social media post from President Trump that really made us think that it was possible that a deal might have been imminent. There was a moment on Saturday where it felt like a deal might have been imminent, but here we are now on Wednesday. We are still kind of just sitting in limbo and waiting to hear what comes of the negotiations that have been happening behind the scenes. When Reuters has reports like this, Edmund, does this say anything about where ceasefire negotiations stand behind the scenes right now?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, we should quickly go back to first principles and remember what this conflict was fought over. The US was determined to ensure that Iran could never have a nuclear weapon, that it could never resume enrichment of uranium. There were also other goals, which included the Iranian ballistic missile program, Iranian support of terrorist groups as proxies against Western allies, and also the state of the well-being of the Iranian people, if you like, after the demonstrations that took place, the protests that took place in January. Now, what has happened during the war that followed is that we now have a fifth file, which is the Strait of Hormuz being closed, and we need that reopened. Now, the two sides, US and Iran, are a very, very long way apart. They always were in February, and they still are now. And I would say that it's possible that the US is willing to settle for major progress on the Strait of Hormuz and major progress on the nuclear file. It may be that the other three files will be left aside. But so far, the evidence is that there is no sign of the Iranians showing real flexibility. They are still on the Strait of Hormuz talking about having a claim to the Strait of Hormuz, a territorial claim, and the right to inspect shipping that goes through. Now, that's against the law of the sea, and the US cannot allow that, precedent to be set. And on the uranium, there's no sign of the Iranians making significant concessions on that. Now, if the Iranians don't make those concessions, then it's impossible for President Trump to walk away and say that the conflict achieved its objectives. So I think the last thing I just want to say is that there is a real issue here over public communications. The Iranians are exercising systematic disinformation. They are trying to portray their side as winning and the other side as duplicitous. And so, when one tries to interpret what the Iranians say, you have to aim off for that disinformation. And of course, on the US side, you also have to aim off for the fact that President Trump is an uneven communicator. He doesn't always say exactly what's happening. And sometimes he is also playing a blind of some kind and trying to unsettle the Iranian negotiators. So we're trying to interpret these statements by both sides, both of which may be quite a long way from the reality.
Let's take a look at this map here. I know that you have particular expertise on the Arabian Peninsula, Edmund. What do the major players in the region, like the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Qataris, what do they want most out of this deal?
So they all have slightly different positions. It's interesting because those countries are closely allied with each other, and they're part of an alliance called the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC. So to some degree, their interests coincide, but they're pursuing different lines. The Saudis have been really keen to get out of this conflict if they can. They haven't really reacted as sharply as they might have done when the Iranians attacked them during the recent, if you like, during the hot phase of the current conflict. The Qataris also, they're stuck because their whole presence is behind the Strait of Hormuz. They have no access out to the open sea other than through the Strait of Hormuz. And Bahrain is in the same situation, and so is Kuwait. The Emiratis have other options because they actually have a coast that gives onto the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Oman, and the Omanis, of course, are also they've also got that access out onto the open sea. So all of them have slightly different priorities here. The Emiratis have been very punchy. They've talked about helping the United States to force the Strait of Hormuz open. They have also taken a certain amount of military action against the Iranians in retaliation for the Iranians attacking them. So each of these countries is looking at this a little differently, and the US is trying to manage its diplomacy with all of them, and with Pakistan, and with Turkey. So it's a complicated situation.
So, what has prevented all out fighting from breaking out again? What's the chief thing that's prevented that from happening so far?
Well, from the Iranian side, of course, they took an absolute hammering from the US and from Israel. Their capabilities have been severely depleted. They have far fewer missiles than they used to have. They have far fewer drones than they used to have. They know that their air defenses cannot stand up against any kind of Israeli or American attack. And their defense industries also have been devastated by Israeli and American attacks. So from the Iranian side, they're bluffing, really. They're pretending to be strong and defiant and pretending that they won the war. In any meaningful military terms, they lost the war hands down. But, of course, their way of surviving, and this was a little bit the same with the Yemeni Houthis when the US engaged with them last year, their way of winning is just to survive. It's just to outlast American patience. So from the American side, there is this question of a political timetable and whether Donald Trump at various points said that this war would not last very long. And so he's trying to manage American expectations that he himself set. Now, the US is more than capable of going back into a more fully fledged war with Iran. Obviously, the target set would be secondary targets, tertiary targets, because so many of the primary targets have already been taken out. But certainly Israel and America can do more damage if they choose to. For now, I think Donald Trump would prefer, by waving a big stick, to get the Iranians to make meaningful concessions on those two files that I mentioned, the Strait of Hormuz and the nuclear file.
Let's take a look at some of the countries on the screen here. This week, President Trump said that any agreement with Iran should include a requirement for several additional countries, including Saudi Arabia, to join the Abraham Accords. Any country that signs the Abraham Accords would be expected to have normalized relations with Israel. There was a piece that Fox News put out and made this little graphic, and I understand that the Israel normalization situation isn't exactly the same with all 8 of these countries. But in general, Edmund, how likely would you say we are to see these countries? I'm really mainly looking at Saudi Arabia. How likely is it that these types of places are to sign on to the Abraham Accords?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is a really interesting new angle to the conflict, and it is interesting to me that the president has now emphasized this. I mean, what he's doing when he does this is he's kind of recognizing that the US has leverage, particularly over the Arabian Peninsula countries, because their business model, their ability to defend themselves and to pursue prosperity and trade, that as you know, of course, the whole sort of prosperity of the Arabian Peninsula has been built on the premise that they were in a close to conflict zones, but they would always be able to avert the actual conflict. Now, that business model has, in a way, broken because the Iranians lashed out at them and attacked them. And that means that if you're in a place like Dubai, the sense of security that you used to have has gone now. So I think President Trump is leveraging that And he's saying, especially to the Saudis, and I think you're right to emphasize the Saudis because they are the swing player here and they are the big power in the Arabian Peninsula. He's saying to the Saudis, look, the Iranians have shown that they might hit you at any time and they won't apologize for doing it. And therefore, if you want the kind of full-throated American support and the kind of air defense that we can provide you, you need to help us to come up with a lasting deal here with the Iranians. But part of that also has to be that we build the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords, of course, representing ultimately a kind of a bulwark against future Iranian aggression. Now, it's still a very, very big ask. It's possible that the Saudis will just simply refuse, because from their point of view, it is a really difficult thing for them to agree to that when they have been saying up to now that they won't accept the Abraham Accords unless there is a concrete path to Palestinian statehood. So this is the difficulty. You mentioned a number of other countries. The Qataris may have their own perspective on this. As you know, the Emiratis, of course, are absolutely at the forefront of the Abraham Accords already. And then Turkey is a slight outlier because it's always had relations with Israel, but its relationship with Israel has grown very increasingly difficult in recent years.
Edmund, appreciate the time tonight. Take care.
Most welcome.